All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another wonderful evening of See and Learn 2019. Woo! For those See and Learners that have been joining us thus far this month, you have made it halfway. We're already halfway done with this program. It's crazy. It's going by so fast. For those of you who have just joined us, these are, it skipped this slide, or it's not responding. I have a pretty picture. All right. 1 second, guys. Let me get that pretty picture on the screen.
Put on, John. Yeah. Thank God it wasn't what you were looking at earlier.
Jeez Louise, man.
Is the Wi-Fi strong here?
It says it's pretty connected.
It's got a bar missing. Okay, that's why it's stuff. Okay, just put the power back on.
They all got like little leopard spots.
Just too far away from
They
it.
look, I think they're
Should I be moving this closer, or?
Yeah, they've got like all the leopard patterns.
So I can maybe put it in front of them.
Jump inside to see, so it's probably this is
Because you got wood blocking it.
This is going to suck.
Yeah.
So let's lift this puppy up and stick it in.
We just need connection so that he can do that.
Well, let's just keep it like that for now.
Okay.
It's working now.
Okay.
If it fucks up, fine.
Yeah, final.
From there.
I got it, yeah.
Just go for the. Don't go for the video. Just go.
Yep. Okay. All right. We're going to try this again, guys. So, See and Learners that have been with us since the beginning, like I said, we're halfway. Those of you joining us today, some pretty pictures of what's been going on so far in this October of 2019. For those of you that may not know what See and Learn does, we actually have a wide range of groups that we work with. So we go with the schools, and we work with the primary and the secondary schools. They get some hands-on kind of experience with science. They actually just dissected fish with Kamani over here. Yeah. We also have terrestrial and marine field projects for all of you guys. So those of you who are divers and like to go underwater, one of the things we just did is a seagrass experiment where we cut out some seagrass and then got to see what exactly we were cutting out. It was really cool. We also just had tropic bird hike where we went to go find some nesting sites. And of course, we have the public presentations where you guys are all hanging out with us tonight. And we also work with the elderly as well. So we do presentations with them. They get something to look forward to. They love engaging with the conversations, sharing some past experiences, gets to teach our experts a little bit more about our island as they share their knowledge about their field of expertise. So you got some really cool stuff. Still a lot more going on. We have the sign-up sheets in the back if you guys are interested in joining some field projects, some more presentations, all the fun things. Keep hanging out with us. And we do want to thank you guys, of course, for joining us here in the courtyard near Shea Booba. Those of us that are those of you who are joining on the virtual world of Facebook, thank you for tuning in with us. We do encourage you guys to comment where you're watching from. And if you have any questions at the end for our expert, go ahead and comment with your question. We'll try to get that answered for you. So with that, we do want to give a thank you to our sponsor, Carib Trans, for making it possible that we can share it with people all around the world. So thank you, Carib Trans. Yeah. And thank you to Althea Cottage for hosting our expert and making him feel at home here on Ceiba. Hey. And a big thank you to Prince Bernhard Culture Funds and the government of Ceiba for your generous donations and kind support. So thank you both. And one more huge thank you to all of our sponsors. Without them, this wouldn't be possible. So thank each and every one of you guys for your support. Some of you may have just been buying some raffle tickets and may not have known what you guys are actually trying to win. So here we go. Here's our raffles we got going on right now. Starting from the upper corner, we have 2 round-trip tickets on the Dawn 2 ferry going back and forth from St. Martin and Ceiba Island. We also have a wine gift basket from Shea Booba. You guys who are sponsoring us tonight, thank you guys for hosting us. We also have a handcrafted knife made by John. They're really beautiful, quite sharp. You guys can cut through anything very easily. And we have a 2-night stay at Travel Inn. It is on, drumroll, St. Martin Island. So those of you guys who told us, it's on St. Martin. And we also have 3 prizes from Aquamania, a sunset sail for 2 around St. Martin. We also have 2 round-trip tickets on the Edge going from St. Martin to Ceiba. And we have a tango dinner cruise for 2 going around St. Martin Island. Some really cool stuff. We also have a beautiful handcrafted glass art. It's going to be a mermaid and a seahorse made by Joe Bean. Yeah. And we have a 2-for-1 certificate for 8 days, 7 nights aboard the Caribbean Explorer 2 that visits St. Martin, Ceiba, and St. Kitts Islands. Some really great stuff. So if you guys haven't entered to win yet, it's only $2 per ticket. All right, and the moment you guys have all been waiting for to get our expert speaker up in front stage. So a little bit of background for you guys. Who's going to be talking to you tonight? Oh. We'll go back, and we'll try this again. All right. Jim Ackerman obtained his PhD from Florida State University and is currently professor and director of the Natural History Collections, Herbarium, and Zoology Museum at the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras. He has supervised numerous graduate students and written over 145 scientific articles and 3 books, mostly on orchid ecology, taxonomy, and evolution. He has conducted field studies in the United States, Central and South America, and the Caribbean. Tonight, Jim will be presenting on orchid populations on small islands like Ceiba. Please give a warm welcome to Jim Ackerman.
Hi there. Well, that's a good start. We got a response. All right. So what I'm going to talk to you about is a project that we did here on Ceiba and Statia, and a long time ago. Well, you know, it started probably more than 10 years ago, and just getting around to writing it up and getting it published. And so See and Learn thought it was a great opportunity for us to, share it with you. Okay, so small populations on small islands. All right, what chance does an orchid have? Well, first of all, what's the big deal about small populations on small islands? Well, let's look at the Eastern Caribbean, because that's where we are. Islands in general, here in the Eastern Caribbean, Ceiba also, no exception there, and practically all the islands in the tropics are highly disturbed. Now they're highly disturbed for a couple reasons. Well, 2 major reasons. One of them is that there's natural disturbances. And then there's also the human-caused disturbances. So let's take a look at some examples of that. Okay, tsunamis is one. Now, in the tsunamis, you can imagine when the asteroid hit the Yucatan Peninsula, the tsunami was pretty radical. Now, if you think about it, of course, that ended up wiping out the dinosaurs, except for birds. But if you think about it, more in our, well, it's not our time, but fairly recent history compared to geological time, when Krakatau blew its top back in 1886, I think it was, the tsunami went around the world 3 times. You know, that's so you can imagine an asteroid do that. What's going on here? Okay. Back we go. Okay. So the tsunamis is one of the natural disturbances. Another one, of course, is volcanism, and hopefully we're not going to experience that tonight. But it certainly can cause problems, as Montserrat has found out, and many other places in the world. And then another one is hurricanes. Of course, the hurricanes that you guys have experienced a couple years ago, or one of them was the same that I experienced, and this was Hurricane Maria. After most of the damage has been done, in Puerto Rico, the worst of it was in the middle of the night, and I slept through it. I got up in the morning. Of course, there's a roar outside, and after a while, your adrenaline just says, time to go to bed. And so I went to bed. I was in a nice, secure, concrete home with staying with my neighbor. And when I woke up, that's what I saw. And then when the winds died down enough so it was safe to go outside, this is what the rainforest out the window looked like. It's just nothing but a bunch of toothpicks. And so it's pretty devastating what a hurricane can do. And that was category 4 or 5. So that's not what you normally think of what a tropical rainforest looks like, but that's the way it was. Okay, then there's the human disturbances, and the Caribs and the Taínos, they disturbed the islands, but not to the extent that the Europeans did when they arrived into the islands. And initially, they were just trying to meet their basic needs. Cutting trees to build homes, and also for cutting trees for charcoal, because that was wood was the source of energy back then. And then cutting trees so you can plant crops. So it's basically food, shelter, and fuel. What humans were disturbing the landscape, at least initially, and then. These are old photographs of Puerto Rico, and then came big agriculture. So up in the hills it was all tobacco. Well, tobacco in some areas, coffee, and then in the lowlands it was sugarcane, just like in other islands of the Caribbean. So the cash crop agriculture was really devastating to the islands. And then, of course, urbanization happens. At some point, many of the tropical islands shift their economy from agrarian based economy to more like tourists or industry, like has happened in, that's actually Hawaii. That's so kind of cheating there. That's not exactly St. Martin. It could be, though, in the future. Okay, so small islands, on small islands, they're more susceptible to disturbance because there's not that much territory, and humans have a tremendous impact when they get to the islands. Okay, so small populations on islands can be highly vulnerable. And a good example of that is Hurricane Irma and Barbuda. which is only 161 square kilometers. There's a satellite picture of it right over here. Population of just 1,600 people, more or less. And then right after the hurricane, population was 100. And from what I hear from the news, maybe you guys know, a few days later it was 0. Yeah, everybody was gone. So at least almost just a day or two after the hurricane, it was 94% hurricane loss due to the hurricane. So that's humans. Okay, in Puerto Rico, we got hit by Maria, as I shown before. We have a population of 3 million, 3.5 million. Of course, our population, our island size is much larger than Barbuda. So 3.5 million people, more or less. You can see how crowded the streets are. Very typical scene every day. And then, after Maria passed and devastated the island, we only had a 9% loss. 300,000 people left the island. And they still are leaving the island. Okay, and so that's what the population looked like. Not a whole lot of dancing going on. Socializing at the gas station, waiting for the gas truck to show up. Okay, so small populations on small islands. I gave examples of humans, but it applies to plants, it applies to lizards and snakes and birds. It applies to everything, basically. Okay, for small islands, this is what we might expect the flora and fauna, to be like. They should show some resilience, so they bounce back after a big disturbance, like a hurricane or a tsunami. Or they show resistance. Some trees are really strong and can withstand major wind forces. So there's resistance against disturbance. And then there's dispersibility. Okay, so the populations may be wiped out, but immigration to the islands is frequent, and so you can reestablish because you can get around very easily. Colonization abilities. Once they get here, it's very easy to establish. So we expect that. And the other thing is that we expect them to be generalists. All right, so the plants and the animals that you interact with, you should not be specializing on any one. For example, if you need a fungus in your roots, mycorrhizal fungus, you should not be specializing on a single species of fungus because it makes you vulnerable, because that fungus can be in trouble too if there is a disturbance. So generalists, we expect them to be generalists in their interactions. All right. Okay, so finally I'm going to talk about an orchid. Yeah, I know you've been waiting. She's about time. All right. This this happens to be, in my humble opinion, of course I'm not very humble, but Brassavola cuculata is one of the most gorgeous orchids in the Caribbean, if not the most. And this is an orchid that occurs in all of these places. Actually in Central and South America, right along around in the Caribbean basin, Trinidad, Tobago, all these islands with the check marks, they occur there, including, St. Thomas. But St. Thomas didn't appear on this map. I don't know, tsunami hit it or something. So those are historical records. I don't know if they still occur there, but those are historical records. So they're here on Ceiba and also on Statia and nearby islands. So I'm going to tell you the story of 3 populations of Brassavola cuculata. 2 of them on Statia, a population on the quill a population on Boven. So opposite ends of the island of Statia. And then a population here over in Spring Bay Trail, well, off the trail, as some of you discovered the other day. Okay, so these are some of the smallest inhabited islands on in the Caribbean. Ceiba, we're only at about 13 kilometer squares, and St. Eustatius is about 21 kilometers square. Okay, so the big question is this a sign of healthy or declining populations? And I got started on this project because of Hannah Madden contacted me. She was the woman that talked about the tropic bird. She contacted me and said, hey, interested in whether or not I have to be concerned about the orchids on Statia. And at that time she worked with Stanapa. And I had some grant money. I thought, well, sure, I'll come over and check it out. And so what followed was years of work in Statia and here. Okay, so that was my goal, find out what's happening with these small populations. Okay, there's the quill behind this tree here, and Boven over there, and of course we're taking the picture over here on Ceiba. St. Kitts is in the mist. All right, and so this is what we did. On the quill population, we spent 5 years monitoring Brassavola cuculata. And there's Hannah and my colleague Raymond Tremblay and an intern that was working with Hannah at the time. And all the plants over on the quill were epiphytes. That means they were growing on trees, okay? And this is what we did. We tagged every plant, we measured it, we sized it, we assessed it for reproductive effort, which means are they producing flowers, and fruit production and herbivory. And so we're doing all those things. That was at the quill population. Boven is very different, on the same island, but very different. Most of the plants are growing on these huge rocks. And there's Hannah once again looking at one of the plants. And we did the very same thing as we did over in Quill. Tagged, measured, the whole works. And then over here on Ceiba, we studied the Spring Bay population for 5 years. And with the help of Mikael Buchan and Mike Bechtold. So we measured all the same stuff, sometimes being entertained by the goats. Okay. Now brace yourselves. I'm a scientist. And sometimes, I just can't help myself, and I have to show you some data. But don't worry, I'll walk you through these things. Okay, remember, we tried to assess what the traits of the population were, and one of the things that we're very interested in is how big the plants were. And the way we did that was count the number of leaves on the plant. The more leaves, the bigger the plant. So that's what this is. This circle, it's not a circle, it's oval, represents small plants, little small plants, 1 to 2 leaves. And over on this end of the spectrum are the big plants. And these have more than 20 leaves. And then all these arrows all over the place reflect their fate from one year to the next. So One possibility is a little plant can die, or it could stay little, or it could move up to the next category. And these can move up to the next category, so forth. So every stage can either die, get smaller. Well, the smallest plants can't get smaller. They're probably dead then. But the other categories can get smaller or larger or stay the same. Okay, or die. And then these, the hair up on top is, reflects seed production. Okay, so those arrows reflect seed production. Actually, I don't know why that arrow's right there. Interesting, but it's supposed to go to here. All right, so the largest size plants, 7 to 20 leaves, and the more than 20 leaves, those are the reproductives. Those are the ones that produce flowers. Okay. And then all of this stuff here, which I hardly understand myself, but that's just to impress you. Okay, here's another one. There's a bunch of dots here, as you can see. And on this scale is the number of leaves. So these are small plants down here. All these, lots of small plants. And very few large plants, so no big surprise there. And then this is the length of the longest leaf. And if you notice, you can forget about the dots and just look at the lines. There's statistical means of doing this. And the green line are the plants in Ceiba, and those two lines up there are from plants in those two populations on Statia. And so this actually says that Ceiba plants tend to be smaller and younger. Why that's the case, I have no idea. But there's, that's just the general trend. All right. Small plants. This is what we found. After 1 year, a small plant has a 20% chance of dying. And about half of them can stay the same, and the rest, they can move up to the next size class. Okay, so here's a picture of some orchids, some young orchids. This doesn't happen to be Brassivola cuculata, but it's a orchids that actually occur here. These are little seedlings. So what do you think? Those have a higher probability of dying than this one? The answer, way in the back. The answer is yes. Okay, so yes, those have the highest probability of dying. If you get to this size, you have much higher probability of surviving. Okay. There we go. Okay. Then big plants. This would be a big plant, and Lindsay is holding another big plant. In general, the bigger you are, the better chance you have for survival. So less than 1% of the big plants will die from 1 year to the next. So you want to be big in this world. 85% of them stay the same size. Okay. This is probably the worst slide of all. All right. This symbol way up there. Anybody know the Greek letters? Well, you're going to forget that because I had a lecture with the seniors and nobody knew what that was. So, yeah, you're all. Anyway, yeah, and yet you still remember. Okay. Anyway, that's lambda. Lambda is actually we use that Greek letter for growth rate, and basically, if you have a lambda of 1, your population is not growing. You don't have more individuals, you don't have less individuals, you're just stable. If you have a lambda of more than 1, that means your populations are growing. You have more individuals from one year to the next. Now, if you have a population less than 1, that means your populations are shrinking. All right, got that? The quill, the bovine, the Ceiba. What's happening? Populations are shrinking. All 3 populations are shrinking. And, oh, you guys, I should have covered this up. Yeah, they're shrinking. You want to study this some more? No? Okay. All right. So the big question is, why are they shrinking? And we have lots of ideas of why population might be shrinking. And one of them is kind of a stock answer for those that study orchids. One of them is that Brassavola cuculata employs deceit to attract pollinators. So these plants flower at night, and they're very fragrant. And so they are visited by these moths, you know, Protoambulix strigulus, actually, I'm not showing that one, the Manduca, and these are hawk moths. They're kind of the, you know, there's 2 basic kinds of moths. One kind of moth is what we call a settling moth. And they tend to be smaller moths, and some people even call them micro moths, microlepidopterans. And when they visit a flower, they flutter sometimes. Sometimes they just land on the flower, stick the proboscis, and probe the flower for nectar. Then the other kind of moths are like these big guys, the sphingids. These are hovering moths. They're like the hummingbirds of the moth world. And so they're attracted to the fragrance, and when they get close, they can see the flower usually because it's very white, and if there's, you know, actually they can't see enough so that they can find things visually, but its primary attraction is the fragrance. Then they come up to the flower, they unroll their tongue, because the tongue on hawk moths is very long. And of course they don't fly around with their tongue hanging out, and you know, so they coil it up when they're flying, and then when they're feeding they uncoil it and then probe the flower while they're hovering to get to the nectar. And most of the flowers that are visited by hawk moths produce lots of nectar. Because you can imagine if you're over there hovering, you're using a lot of energy. So generally they offer a fairly good reward. But Brassavola cuculata, like so many orchids, a lot of orchids, almost 50% of the orchids, do not offer any reward to the pollinators. No nectar. And anybody here know how many orchids there are in the world? 28,000. You've been reading my papers? Yeah, okay. Yeah, he knows the plant list.
28,001.
Well, actually, 28,000 is the general figure I was going to say, and but there's new ones being. Okay, we got 28,000 here. We got 28,000 on one. What do I hear back there? $1.50. In other words, orchids are nasty. they fool the pollinators. At least about 50% of them fool the pollinators. And that's pretty nasty. But anyway, these things will visit the flower and probe it for nectar. They're not getting it, but what they pick up instead are the pollen masses from the orchid. And then what they do next is they fly to another flower. And those pollen masses get deposited on another flower. And they'll do this a couple times before, well, it depends on how smart these moths are. If they're really dumb moths, they'll just keep on visiting them until, I don't know, they run out of flowers. But generally, they're pretty smart. So after a few visits, they're gone. And they don't visit the plants anymore. Because the thing is that they visit one flower, it's empty, and the moth's saying, well, I guess my buddy Fred came by and took the nectar before me, so I better go fly to another flower. And so they fly to another flower, and he goes, Angela visited this before me, and I'll fly to another flower. Maybe they'll get the nectar. And then after a while, they said, forget it. These things all been visited by somebody else. All right. The end result is a number of fruits produced by these orchids, including Brassavola cucullata, is very low. Here's a fruit. You can see the size of the dirty fingernail compared to compared to the fruit. Few fruits produce, 2.5 to 7% estimated fruit set that we got. Now you say, well, how do I compare that? Well, in general, at least for orchids, if you produce a nectar reward, then on average about 45% of your flowers will end up producing fruits. Okay? So from 45% to just less than 10, low fruit production. Okay. All right. The other possibility is that there's just no recruitment. Sure, you produce fruits, and guess what? Those fruits, even though there are very few of them, they may produce 100,000 seeds. The seed is just dust. Okay? And they they're carried by the wind. And they're carried by the wind, and if they land in an appropriate site with a little bit of moisture there, what we think they do is produce a chemical. There's only been one experiment with this. And so I'm going to generalize from an instance of one for all 28,002 orchid species. Anyway, so what they do is they produce a chemical. The seed produces a chemical. Let me tell you about the seeds. Besides being so small, and I wish I had some seeds here to not show you because you can't see it from way back there. The parental plant invests almost nothing in these seeds. You can imagine that. If they're producing 100,000 seeds in that little fruit, they're not giving those seeds anything to work with. The seed is just a few seed coat cells and then a little ball of cells inside which represents the embryo. Just a small, tiny ball of cells. And it's that tiny ball of cells that produces the chemical. And what they are attracting is a fungus, often a pathogenic fungus. And the fungus, well, you know what a fungus hyphae looks like? Did you check your refrigerator lately for that bread that's in there for a couple months? And it looks kind of fuzzy. You know, the little tiny fuzz, well, that's like a hyphae. That's just that thin. Very, very slender. But if those hyphae detect that chemical signal, they will follow the chemical gradient to find that seed. Then they go into the seed, very easy to get inside, and penetrate the embryo, and they will go into the cells of the embryo. Each cell of the embryo can have fungi. And then what they do is the plant, well, it's a seed, but that's a plant. They have the metabolic machinery to change the behavior of the hyphae. And the hyphae start coiling within the cells. And they get into this dense ball. And then the embryo digests the fungus. So the fungus is creeping into the seed to digest the seed, but then the seed says, I'm eating you. And that's where they get their energy to germinate and grow until they can photosynthesize and be independent. And sometimes they're never independent. So I'm telling you, if you think orchids are beautiful, wonderful little plants, I hold that orchids are the meanest, nastiest plants on this planet. They fool the pollinators and they digest the fungi, parasitize the fungi. Nasty, I'm telling you. Okay, so almost no recruitment. Okay, you're producing hundreds of thousands of seeds. All right, they go out in the environment. You know, why aren't they germinating? Well, there may not be the right environmental conditions, not the water, not the sunlight or whatever. And they may not have any fungi nearby. And sure, that little ball of cells can divide once or twice, but after that, they're like, and that's it. They got to have the fungus. So maybe there are two bottlenecks. One, pollination. Two, getting the fungi. Okay? Maybe that's the reason why. Okay. And indeed, we have very little recruitment. As you might have read down here on the bottom, we got only 11 plants in recruitment in all those years. And that was just at Boven. And it only happened in 1 year. 5 died, 4 stayed the same, 2 increased in size. For all those orchids that we looked at. Low recruitment. Okay, then there's herbivory. All right. All these arrows here point to leaves that have been chomped on. A tip there, some of them more radical than others. I mean, this type of herbivory, there's this is a big plant. A lot of leaves have been eaten, but it's really not going to make a whole lot of difference to this plant. Yeah. But occasionally, somebody gets really hungry and just takes the plant. There's our tag right there. And so you can have mortality. And, who are the critters? Well, possibilities, iguanas, rats. I don't have a picture of a rat, no pictures of politicians. There's, I hope there's none here. And goats, of course. And of course, goats are a sensitive issue here as well as in Statia. So those are the likely culprits. Okay. One of the things that we looked at was how high the plants were growing on the rocks or on the trees, wherever they were. So this is another graph, height above ground. And, all of these down here had no herbivory, 0. And then way up there, those are the ones that had herbivory, And so most of the herbivory is happening at a low height. You know, in other words, in a place where goats can get to them. Now, iguanas and the rats, they can climb up into the trees and eat stuff. And indeed, you know, you get up above 2 meters, and there's a couple that, you know, do get eaten. So maybe the rats and iguanas are responsible for those. Or maybe there's some super goat that can climb trees. I don't know. Has anybody seen goats climb trees? Oh. Ceiba. Actually, I've seen pictures of goats climbing trees in Hawaii. So I was curious to see if you guys saw. All right. So, and then, you know, there's some fancy statistics that we do that gives us this line of probability. But anyway, you know, basically, you know, about 2 meters, if you have a good chance of escaping herbivory. Not that herbivory is going to make a huge difference anyway, but it could, as I pointed out, total loss of a plant. Okay. All right. This is, you know, somebody was complaining the other day, you know, that, you know, we just might as well cut our wrist because everything is going to hell. You know, whether it's the tropic birds or the conch or, you know, all these things. As it turns out, declining orchid populations is not unusual. There's a recent study that somebody gathered all the studies done on demography of orchids in the tropics. And she found, she found about 20 studies of orchid demography. 18 of those showed declining populations. Only 2 were at stable or growing. So you might say it's normal for orchid populations to be declining. Of course, this is not sustainable. But one of the things that I think is going on is that recruitment is rare. Certainly, it was rare in my study. It's rare, but I'm hopeful that it is spasmodic. That there might be, you know, the planets align and, you know, the pollinators are going to, lots of pollinators and lots of pollination, lots of fruit and seed production, and then the seeds are dispersed and it's nice and wet and then ideal conditions for fungi and you get, you know, a lot of recruitment, either in the existing populations or at a new site. That's what I think. That's what I hope. Because all these declining populations, some of them were in pristine areas. And so it kind of makes sense. So you have suddenly a big recruitment and then no recruitment. And so that population is gradually going to get smaller and smaller and smaller over time. And then hopefully another big recruitment. And considering that we have 28,003 orchids out there, orchid species, I think they've been pretty successful. They may be relatively rare compared to other plants, but they have been successful. Okay. Okay, so what can we do? All right, here's the strategy. Do nothing. Sort of. You can wait, monitor, see what happens. But if things start getting, you know, kind of dicey, you might sprint to action. And the action that you might take is, well, one of them, control some goat populations. And sure, herbivory is not a really big deal. But if you are out with us over in Spring Bay, you may have noticed, at least I have noticed, that there's very little recruitment, not only of orchids, but the trees that the orchids are dependent on growing on. And you need, for those that are growing on the rocks, those rocks are shaded. They don't usually grow out on naked rocks in the full sun. So one of the things is control the goat populations, or just fence them, fence areas where the populations are. Another one is if you're out there hiking and you see a fallen tree and there's an orchid on it, gently remove it and attach it to another tree, nearby. Okay? And that's because if they're epiphytes and they fall on the ground, they're doomed. Okay. And then there's another possibility of ex situ propagation and reintroduction. There you're going to have to get some expertise of, technical expertise, orchid growers and lab scientists to help with orchid propagation. And then grow them to a size of at least 7 leaves, because if they're too small, probability of death and failure goes way up. So you have to have good-sized plants before you take them out in the field, and then plant them about 2 meters or more above the ground. And then if you're thinking long range, put them up a little bit higher than where they normally grow. For here in the Caribbean, what's happening is it's getting hotter and drier for this section of the Caribbean. And so, what it seems to be a appropriate habitat in one place, in the future, maybe in the near future, it won't be an appropriate habitat. So that's something you have to consider in long term. Okay, so those are the strategies, and that's all, folks. Uh-oh, Joe Bean. Yes, ma'am.
People propagate orchids in test tubes.
Yes.
Do they introduce those?
Well, they start in petri dishes or test tubes, but then they have to plant them out and eventually get them into little pots, and so it's a process.
But do they introduce the mold? The mold. The algae.
Oh, the fungi?
Fungi.
No, because if you have, if they get up to a size where photosynthesis can happen, they don't really need the fungi. But most plants, the fungi is absolutely necessary for epiphytic, all orchids, at the germination stage. Orchids that grow on the ground, they need the fungi for a lot longer period of time so that they can emerge from the ground, get big enough, and to photosynthesize. And most orchids actually maintain a relationship with fungi. And the fungi that stimulates germination is not necessarily the fungi that sticks with the plant. So you could put out the plant, a plant that's sufficient size that their they can make their own food. You could put that out, and over time they'll probably accumulate fungi in the roots. And they do the same thing. They digest the pelotons, the coils of fungi. And there's some research that says at that stage it could be a mutualistic relationship. The plant may be giving something to the fungi at that stage. That's an also sample size about 1 there. So, yes, sir.
You talked a lot about reproduction, recruitment by seeds. Do we know anything about how important asexual reproduction is in relation to the sexual reproduction?
Okay, the question is about the relative importance of asexual and versus sexual reproduction. It really depends on the orchid. You know, in Brassavola, there is they are what we call clump plants. Cespitose plants is the technical term for it. So they, unless a really big plant, you know, sometimes you can't tell how many plants, you know, it started out with, but they stick on the same rock and the same tree. They don't, you know, there's very little asexual reproduction going on naturally. Yeah. Any other? Yes. I can't see hands, you know.
So for germination, do orchids have a specific species of fungus that they turn to? Like, is it one species of orchid likes only one species of fungus, or can it recruit many species?
Okay, the question is about specificity in the orchid mycorrhizal associations. And what we have found so far is if the orchid has a very specific fungus, generally that fungus is all over the place. I mean, it's, you know, take for example here on Ceiba, we have one invasive orchid, one orchid that has naturalized and has spread over in the last 10 years. And that's Ecioclades maculata. And one of my colleagues, that wasn't him, one of my colleagues, who was a mycologist and worked with orchid mycorrhizae, and he found that with Ecioclades maculata, it was very specific in which fungus stimulated germination. And that fungus is very common. But after a while, lots of other fungi, after germination, other fungi got involved. And so if you took the roots of those plants and you got the fungi out of them, you'd find there would be lots of fungi in there. And fungi that are creating those coils of hyphae that the orchid digests. So then there are other examples where there tend to be generalists. So if they're generalists, then it doesn't matter whether some of them are very local fungi or not. You know, so that's the whole idea of being a generalist, especially in places where there's lots of disturbance and like small islands. Way in the back.
Way in the back. Wait. So you did a walk down to Spring Bay Trail for the Brassula and things like that. Have you done any hikes up the mountain yet where you found Brassula as well? And ergo facilitating the spread of Brassula around on the island? Or is it really just down in Spring Bay Trail where it's growing?
No, what is this, the dancing, yeah. It's down there, and then there's a couple other places that we know about, but the biggest population is Spring Bay.
I'm just asking.
And above, no.
So you were talking about relocating them
Yeah.
to make it more populous around the island, but how keen are those orchids to take on new climates if they specifically breed down in more of the arid sides of the island?
I would not move them real high. You know, maybe no more than 100 meters or maybe 50 meters higher elevation than where you found them. Yeah. Because, you know, well, we just don't know how fast climate change is going to happen. And you don't want to take them too far out of the current situation. because that could, damage things. Yes, sir?
As with like exotic animals, is there a threat for cultivation from humans to seek out special orchids and try to take them, not rather than sell it? Is there like a black market for orchid trade or anything, or is it relevant that it's not a big
Okay, the question is about the whether there's collecting pressure on orchids, and there is. I haven't seen it for Brassivola cucullata in Statia or here, but my colleague who's coming next week, Frank Axelrod, he tells me that over time, and he's been working on the flora of Ceiba. Over time, he's seen fewer orchids up on Mount Scenery, and he thinks that it might be because of collecting pressures. And I went up there huffing and puffing today, and I'm not as young as I used to be, like some of you here, and one of the things that struck me, because the last time I was up there was almost 10 years ago, one of the things that struck me was that a lot of the trees have fallen down, and from hurricanes, I assume. And so, for example, the bench right at the crater rim, when you're gasping for breath, just as you reach that point, there's a bench there. It's all in the bright sunlight now, and in the past it was all shaded. There used to be trees and orchids on those trees around that bench. So Frank thinks maybe there's been some collecting activity, and he claims that James Johnson has caught people with bags of plants, and so that may be what's happening here, at least on Mount Scenery.
How does that trade work? 'Cause I feel like an orchid's a sensitive plant that you can't just stuff in a duffel bag and bring it back to the U.S. or something, or would have to sell in the local market here or something.
Okay, well, there's two things going on. What he's talking about, well, what's the market? How do you get these things to market? But actually, most of this activity is by hobbyists, that they see an orchid and they just can't help themselves. And there's in terms of massive collecting for commercial purposes, that doesn't happen in too many places. Vietnam and China are famous for that, and there's efforts to try to control that in places like that. But here, I think it's hobbyists that are doing it. Yeah, or their house, or they have a greenhouse full of orchids. Yeah. Yes.
For amateurs like us that live on Ceiba and have access, I have orchids at my house that regularly have these seed pods and seeds and that. How is, without knowing anything like scientists know, is there any way of making the seeds into orchids?
Yeah, you can actually pollinate them if you wanted to, but
the seeds. Have the seeds grow. I've got plenty.
Okay. The question is, what can we do to promote, establishment, recruitment of orchids locally? From seed. You could, when the I was about to say nothing, but you can actually do something, and that is get the fruits just as they're splitting open, and spread the seeds around. Yeah. So you've heard of Johnny Appleseed?
Do you know how many years I've tried that sucker?
But actually, sometimes it works. But basically, yeah, it's hope for the best. Yes?
Does this orchid grow anywhere else besides the Caribbean? And if so, how's it doing there?
Where does this orchid grow? Well, the orchid grows in the eastern Caribbean, along the northern coast of South America, Venezuela and Colombia, Panama, all the way up into the Yucatan. And how is it doing in those places? We have no idea. Yeah. The most that we know about Brassavola cucullata, you guys know it from what I just told you. Yeah. We have a question in the back.
If pollination is limiting, what is the natural selection? What's the evolutionary advantage of this deceit pollination method?
Okay. If pollination is so limiting, what's the advantage to the orchid? I spent about 3 decades of my life trying to answer that question. But I wasn't the only one. But basically, there's been some examples to show that it enhances the probability of cross-pollination. And there are other mechanisms for doing it. And to me, that is not the right explanation. That's a Darwinian explanation, but that's the explanation that you would give for any plant out there. So why orchids get away with it? I don't know. I think the answer is still, unanswered. Well, the question is still unanswered. So I know that's very unsatisfying for you because, you sound like an intelligent guy who probably read all my papers and wanted to know what the latest was. I hate to tell you I wasted 3 decades before.
Nectar production energetically costly?
Yes, but there's been some dispute about that. There are a number of examples of orchids that produce nectar and they reabsorb it before dehiscing the flower. Or they reabsorb it at, like there was one in a study in Africa, some angricoid orchid in an epiphyte. And what the orchid was doing, it's like the Brassavola cucullata in that it's a nighttime flowering visited by hawk moths. So they'd have the nectar in the flower during the night, then they reabsorb it during the heat of the day. And then the flower lasts for a week or 2 weeks, depending on whether it gets pollinated or not. And then each night it produces the nectar back into the cavity where the hawk moth would try to probe it. So that suggests that it is expensive relative to the budget of the orchid. And other people say, no. So, I don't know. Sometimes it can be expensive, sometimes maybe not. And, I kind of explored that in some of my papers. Yes?
How long can they live?
Well, we have, with Brassavola cucullata, we have plants that have maybe 200 leafy shoots on it. And generally speaking, a plant would produce 1 shoot at a time. But if the conditions are very good at that particular site, on that particular plant, on rock or tree, they may produce multiple shoots each year. So, a plant with 200 leafy shoots, it's not 200 years old, but it's old. So, and as long as the substrate is around, you know, it potentially could live, you know, forever. Of course they don't, but because eventually something will eat it, or it gets rot, or something like that. But they can live a long time. Other questions? No. I am sorry. Someone did not ask the question that I've been waiting. And so you're not going to get free until I get to say this. You're supposed to say, Jim, how many species of orchid are there on Ceiba? Joe Bean asked me this yesterday. And, you know, I didn't have an answer. I just made a guess because I don't remember those numbers. So I prepared myself for that question today, and you guys didn't answer it. Do you want to know it? Yes. 26 species of orchids on Ceiba. Now, some of them we haven't seen for, 50 years or so, or more. But they may still be there someplace. But 26. You happy now? Thank you.
Fun, educational, entertaining presentation. Another round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Been wild and crazy.
All right, so we have a few more upcoming events for the second half of See and Learn this year. Tomorrow we have a 1 o'clock dive with Kimani, who's right over there, ready to do fish surveys with you guys. Then on Tuesday is his presentation at Queen's Gardens at 5:30 p.m. Then we have a sound or acoustics expert coming to the island, Bart Nort, who is in the back somewhere, yes. So you can join him Wednesday for his bat walk. You can see and learn and listen to bats. And then on Thursday is his presentation at Brigadoon. He's going to be doing marine mammals, the sound that they make and how he logs them and records them and everything. It's sure to be very interesting. Like to thank you guys all for coming. It's a big crowd. You're a great crowd. Ask good questions, even though you missed the most important question, apparently. Thank you, Facebook, for joining us. And as always, I'd like to thank all of our sponsors, particularly Shea Booba. Thank you. And, of course, Carib Trans. There we go. Have a good night, everyone.
Miami is known as an international community and the hub of trade and logistics for the Caribbean and Americas. A leader in the freight logistics industry, Carib Trans has served the Caribbean region for more than 30 years, with a footprint that has grown from one island to now serving the majority, as well as Central and South America. Carib Trans is an NVOCC, a non-vessel operating common carrier, meaning it has the same responsibilities as a shipper without owning the vessels or planes. Its primary customers, individual only cars.
Most of the stuff that they're sending is because they don't get it there. So